Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of American History Gazette. I'm Jake Suggs, and today we are joined by Michael Stroud. Michael is a military historian and author and a graduate with a master's degree from American Military University. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
And as I understand it, your family has a long history of military service all the way back to the Revolution, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And start Really my whole interest in history really was peaked from my father. When I in late 70s, somewhere between 78 and 79, I found his army dress uniform hanging up in our closet, and that was from his time in Vietnam. My father's with the 101st Airborne Division from 1969 to 1972, and that kind of sparked my interest to understand what his uniform meant and what his service meant. So I've been able to find out over the years that two grandfathers in World War II, one was a medic in North Africa and Italy, the other one was in the Navy from 1944 to 45. I had an uncle that was part of the occupation forces of Japan, actually, which was pretty amazing. I had another ancestor that was part of Teddy Roosevelt's cavalry corps. He actually tended the horses for the Spanish American War. I just found that out not too long ago, and it goes the Civil War. I had a ancestor that worked who was part of the Union forces. It's my cat trying to make an appearance here. Part of the Union forces for the Ohio Volunteer Infantry, and I had some Confederate ancestors too. And it goes right back to the Virginia Militia, actually, in the Revolutionary War. So long family history.
Wow, that is amazing. That is amazing. I also had an ancestor who served in the Confederate forces. He fought in Alabama, I believe. I'm not too sure of the history there, but that brings us to our subject today. Years ago, our ancestors might have been foes, but today we are here as friends to talk about the Battle of Fredericksburg, one of the bloodiest and biggest battles of the Civil War. A crushing defeat for the Union, um, a huge victory for the Confederacy. But what was this battle took place in 1862 in December. What was the context leading up to the war? How are the Union and Confederacy doing?
Well, at this point, it was late 1862, really kind of dispelled the illusion, if we'll say, of what war was like. At the outbreak of war, a lot of people in the North thought, oh, this is going to be fast. The Union will just sweep in. We'll put an end to this rebellion. It'll be over. Well, that quickly became apparent, however, that was not going to happen. And as the war drug on from its outbreak at Fort Sumter in 1861, and especially after the horrific losses at Antietam, that really became critical to both sides, the North and the South, that they had to secure a victory. In the North, it was seen as a missed opportunity. McClellan didn't follow up on the potential that he had at Antietam, and that really didn't sit well with President Lincoln and the other officers, the other movers and shakers, as we'll say, in Washington at the time. But for Jefferson Davis, on the other end, he needed a really strong, clear cut victory as well because the Confederacy was really trying to legitimize their situation. And they needed some strong victories early, especially so they could appeal to the international community to try to get support, recognition, economic assistance, and so on. That's what they were short on, and they know they needed that. So by the time late 1862 came around, it was really critical for both sides that they had a huge win. And so that really was kind of the impetus that kind of drove both armies towards each other at a little town of only about 5,000 people called Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Right. Yes, you could say the stakes were high for both of these armies here. They were both in desperate need of a victory. But what was the strategic objective? Why did this battle occur at Fredericksburg? What was the Union Army trying to achieve there?
Sure. Really, it was a means to an end. The Union Army had decided by this point, after Antietam, that they were going to muster the biggest army that America had ever put in the field at that point, and they were just going to sweep down, and they were going to just basically hammer Richmond, Virginia, and put an end to everything. And now that's a big, grandiose plan. It involves swelling the Union Army to over 123,000 men, which was unheard of up to that point. It's real important context to think of that because in 1862, to pull that many men together is significant in itself, especially because not more than 5, 10 years ago, before that, the United States was effectively a small police force on horseback kind of patrolling the inner United States, and that was about it. So that was a massive undertaking by itself. So they thought, we'll just overwhelm the new Confederacy, as they'll say, and we'll just sweep down to Richmond, Virginia, and put an end to it. So Fredericksburg was kind of like a waypoint because it was a transportation hub at the time between the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. It's kind of like a little junction there. So the plan was, and it was really a combination of basis for this plan was started by McClellan, and then his replacement Burnside kind of came in, kind of took that the core basics of that plan on, fleshed it out, kind of reorganized the Union Army, and made it a point to say we're going to go by Fredericksburg. We're gonna take over the rail junctions, use it more as a staging ground for supplies and men as they push to Richmond, Virginia. On the other end, the Confederacy under Robert E. Lee, who took over after his predecessor was injured, um, decided, okay, so they have numerical superiority, but I know the ground, so I'm going to force them to come to me, where he was more adept at kind of a defensive offensive move, which was Robert E. Lee was very tactically gifted in that he could fight a defensive offensive war. Um, his fallacy comes in overall strategic thinking, but that's a whole nother thing. But here, he thought he would draw the army to him at a ground of his choosing, which wasn't Fredericksburg, actually. He thought he would gauge them at prepared defenses outside of town, but as we know, certain events transpired that kind of threw that out the window for both sides. So that became the engagement in early December, mid-December 1862, actually, instead of the drive to Richmond, Virginia. It all came to a head there first.
Right, right. Yeah. So initially, Burnside, his plan was secrecy and speed, correct? He wanted to march through Fredericksburg and kind of beat Lee's flank towards Richmond so they could march on Richmond and get that victory. But when he got to Fredericksburg, he realized they didn't have the pontoons. His War Department had kinda ghosted him a little bit, right? So they ghosted him. He doesn't have any pontoons, and he's like, "Well, how am I gonna cross this river?" So now there's this huge stall, and then that gives Lee time to kinda come in and prepare his defenses. So what was the situation there? They're waiting at the river, his War Department left him up to dry, they're trying to get over. What's the situation there?
Yeah, that was, it's interesting because the specter of logistics always reigns supreme no matter what age of warfare it was, whether it's ancient times, modern times, or 1862 Virginia. That if anything falls apart there, it's going to throw a monkey wrench into all your plans. So the plan, by this point, Burnside knew that in order to get to Fredericksburg and to get beyond, they had to cross some bridges. Well, the Confederates had destroyed the main bridges already, or the Rappahannock River, so they knew they were going to have to construct pontoons. And you're right. He had sent orders, which should have been, in theory, plenty of time, but there were some, let's just say, some political adversaries that weren't so keen on how things transpired between McClellan and him being his replacement, which Burnside did not want to be the replacement for McClellan at all. He actually refused the order, but he was basically kind of he was involuntarily volunteered to basically take the role on. So he grudgingly accepted the promotion, which says a lot about the man. I want to pause a moment because that takes a really self-aware person to know I'm out of my league going in this role. I really am not the guy for this position, and he voiced that very clearly. But when he was basically pressured, he came, did his duty, and and I think that's important to note that historically, because how many you don't see that a lot in history, in military history especially, where the officer is offered a major promotion and he's like, I'm not the guy for that role, but he took it on, sent the orders to DEC, and you're right, those are kind of shuffled around, let's say, and kind of a lot of things were drug out, and when it finally was pushed around, and that was only because Burnside actually had to follow up on it a number of times, and it became an issue of getting enough transportation mules and horses and pulling it all together. And they did not show a lot of urgency on the transportation end of things, the logistics end. And by that point, he had already had lead elements of the army already at Fredericksburg, that really was a rare occurrence because the Union Army actually stole a day on Lee, which rarely happened for Robert E. Lee to be caught off guard when it comes to mobility in the field. So that right there by itself was a pretty rare and a rare occurrence, but also a missed opportunity for the Union Army. That Union, because they would have had every opportunity with those lead elements to have pushed into Fredericksburg then, and they would have had little opposition at that point. So they could have gained at least a foothold in Fredericksburg early on, but because they didn't, because the officer that was there with his lead elements wasn't authorized to proceed further because Burnside wanted him to hold his ground and wait for the army to come up and solidify his communication lines. That was a missed opportunity, actually. So there's a lot of what ifs there, but that right there was a huge miss, if you ask me. Before Lee was able to consolidate the Army in Northern Virginia there, which caused a whole lot of problems real soon.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that that miscommunication between, the War Department and Burnside to get those pontoons and all these kind of holdups, I think in general, miscommunication is kind of what caused the Union this battle. I think they absolutely could have won it at multiple points, but there's a clear theme of miscommunication and I think also egos at play. But I think miscommunication kind of cost them the battle at multiple points in the long run. But they're sitting at the river and they're waiting to cross. So what is Burnside's initial plan of attack? He wants to attack the flanks, right, and try to punch a hole through the center?
Yep, that's his idea, and he knows in order to really. I should pause first. His lead elements, because they have to cross into town, since he didn't authorize them to push into town, he's like, I want you to occupy some hills with your artillery. So some of the Union artillery is at Stafford Heights, which has a commanding view of the town itself. I've been fortunate enough. I've visited Fredericksburg a lot. I actually go twice a year. I'm part of a member. I'm a member of the Central Virginia Battlefield Trust, which is located in Fredericksburg, and so I go every fall. But I also have friends there, and I love the town. So I've been able to walk a lot of this and partake of the actual grounds. And there are some commanding heights, and Stafford Heights is one of the critical areas. And we'll talk about another key part called Marie's Heights that is very, very huge, um, and played a very important part of the battle in the aspect of the loss of life that occurred in this small, relatively small area is just horrific. But Stafford Heights is where Union artillery was placed so it could shell into the town itself. So knowing that, okay, I'm bringing up the army, which he had reorganized into grand divisions, basically took divisions and made them super divisions. And the analogy I like to say is Napoleon 50 years before did a similar thing when he organized the French army into the Grand Armée, and he made corps systems, basically self-contained small armies. Well, Burnside, in a lot of ways, when he reorganized his massive 123,000 man army, he kind of had a similar idea: grand divisions, a left, right, and a center. And the idea was just to try to kind of swoop around, go in the center, and then just crush on the flanks and roll up the army. But it relied on speed. In an army that size in 1862, that wasn't really happening, and communication affected it. The pontoon delay was a significant threat because it is December and it's cold. The river, the Rappahannock, is got ice flow. It's got ice chunks in it, and it's about 24 degrees. So it's not real fun conditions, especially when you're the attacking force. You have to get across that. It's about 440, let's say, feet altogether. The Rappahannock now by Fredericksburg is much smaller than it was at the time. So it's condensed in more and there's more growth onto the sides. But at the time it's much wider. So it's a wider field. So that poses a lot of problems. So what it did is it allowed for the Confederates to start bringing in more men, occupied the town, and start creating a system of kind of like a hornet's nest because they can go into all the houses. They have good vantage points of any crossing zones, which are basically there were three main crossings that Burnside was trying to use, kind of the upper, the middle, and the southern part. And once they finally started to get their pontoon material there, then it became okay, we have to get across. And that's where some military first occurred for the United States, but we also had to learn some hard lessons about doing that right at that time as well.
Yeah, this really is a battle of first. There's quite a few. Getting across the river, they were under heavy Confederate fire from, as you said, the Confederates who occupied the town of Fredericksburg. So that was the first beachhead established under fire in U.S. military history. Obviously, we see that play out on a much grander scale on D-Day in World War II. Very, very similar situation. So they finally make it across the river. And then we see another first. We see the first time that urban warfare is conducted where they're fighting through the streets. This was an unprecedented style of fighting. They're fighting house to house in some scenarios, just really rough urban warfare.
Yeah, that really was a whole different tier for United States troops. The Confederacy and the Confederate troops that were there were very much in their home ground, right? They were surrounded by citizens that were, for the majority, were in so support of them. So they knew how to utilize all the main firing points. So it really started from the snipers that the Confederates have. So as the Union pontoons are trying to cross over, they were sniping at them, and they were picking off engineers and federal troops like crazy. So really, that held up the move into the city itself quite a bit. Um, and it caused a lot of issues because it got to the point where engineers are getting killed. It's like, well, we have to get across because until we get across, we can't drive these guys out because Union artillery was firing, but it was kind of a joke to the Confederates because it was almost like blind fire. It wasn't really doing much damage to them per se, but unfortunately for the town and the citizens, it was laying waste to Fredericksburg. I mean, it was just blowing houses apart, bullet holes and everything, but it wasn't doing a lot of damage to the Confederate defenders. So the so they learned that you have to have some kind of suppressing fire. So they just try to use mass batteries. Infantry was kind of jumped on the boats to kind of force their way over. They kind of had to run the gauntlet, if you'll say. And that really was from troops from the U.S., from Michigan, and I think it was Massachusetts. Yeah, the 7th Michigan Infantry was part of that. That really kind of forded over the most contested crossing. The good part is Confederate guns couldn't de-elevate enough when they got across the midpoint, and that actually helped them to kind of. The worst part was the initial crossing. They got past the midpoint. Confederate guns couldn't de-escalate, so they were able to sneak through, come up on the rise, and they kind of forced their way up. Once they did that, they had a toehold. You're right. That's when the really bloody business really started in, because then it became okay. We have a beachhead. Now what do we do? Because these guys are everywhere, and you're absolutely right. That's when things really took a different turn from a learning perspective, but also just from that urban brutality that we really hadn't experienced up to that point. And what made that more kind of, I guess, sad in a way is, American against American and house to house. And you're right, it was bayonets, it was hand to hand fighting. It was, they would the Union would try to form blocks of men up to do traditional firing, but that doesn't really work so well when the streets are narrow, and then you're getting hit from this, front, back, at the side. You're getting hit from everywhere. So you had to kind of push in house to house and drive the Confederates out, which they eventually did, and the Union was able to secure Fredericksburg. But that was a little bit kind of a short-lived process, let's say. They had a night where they were out when they first occupied. What's often overlooked about Fredericksburg is it was, boy, it was really the destruction of the town. They were so many of the Union Army were so mad because of all the casualties they took getting across, that they kind of took it out on the town. They were just basically stealing everything. Officers couldn't control the men. There were even reports of some of the officers participating in robbing other people and destroying property. So that was not the finest hour, let's say, of that by any means. But it was a tough occupation, let's say, for everybody involved.
Yeah, it was definitely kind of a sad situation there in Fredericksburg because I believe this was the first time that an American city was ransacked since DC in the War of 1812 and 1814. But what made this sad was it was Americans who were doing it. It wasn't the British, you know? So that's really sad to see Americans sacking their own town. But now the Union Army has control of the town. The real battle kind of takes place behind the town. So Union Army has control of the town of Fredericksburg now. So how do the Confederate forces react to that? What are each of the armies doing to kind of prepare for the next step of the battle?
Well, up to this point too. So the Union has the town itself. However, during this entire time, Lee has been recalling his elements of his army. He's been recalling Stonewall Jackson, and he's had Longstreet. He brought Longstreet and his corps up. Real important, couple real important things here that are important to keep in mind. Longstreet with his men is a raid called Marie's Heights. Marie's Heights in Fredericksburg is one of the most commanding viewpoints in town. Right now, one of the original buildings is still there, and it's the president of the university's house, actually, and it's still up there. But Longstreet had he deployed his artillery on that commanding height, so he had a full view of the flat ground below. That's really grown over a lot now, and it's a much smaller parcel of land than what was at the time. At the base of that hill is the sunken road, it's called, and it's a small stone wall. I think it's 3 or 4 feet high, and it runs right down parallel to Marie's Heights. He deployed his infantry down there right at the hill, and then he had his artillery up, and they commanded full view of the grounds in front of him. So that's important to keep that in mind. At the same time, so he's up there. Stonewall Jackson's coming, occupying his men from Prospect Hill. Prospect Hill runs also is another flank of the Confederate Army. So Prospect Hill is real important because a lot of the material likes to focus on Marie's Heights, and it's a very important part. A lot of casualties, and we'll touch on that absolutely. Prospect Hill, I'm in agreement with historian Frank O'Reilly, who I'm going to plug. This is probably this is the ultimate book on the Fredericksburg campaign. Frank O'Reilly is actually a 40-year National Park Service historian, and this is actually the best book on Fredericksburg that I've seen. I've got a lot of them. I've actually been fortunate enough to speak with Frank a lot and actually have a couple personal tours from Frank of it's part of a small group in Fredericksburg. So it's excellent book. But kind of bringing back, but Stonewall, he's got his men and artillery holding Prospect Hill, and Prospect Hill is actually where the entire battle could have really been won because the Union managed to achieve something that was really rare at the time, and that's they achieved actually a breakthrough on Jackson's line, which is real important to keep in perspective because A, that didn't happen much, and B, if that would have been exploited, we would have seen we would have seen a different outcome. Absolutely.
Exactly. That's kind of what I was talking about earlier with the miscommunication and the egos at play, because they did break through Jackson's line and they had them vulnerable there, but as kind of the battle was progressing, they were getting surrounded. They were in need of reinforcements. And I believe it's General Meade, he sent an aide to go request reinforcements, and I forget who it was, but they were like, "Oh, I don't take orders from General Meade," and he refused to send the reinforcements. It's those egos and that miscommunication really cost them the battle. It could have been won here. They broke through the line. He was requesting reinforcements, and they never came, and then they had to withdraw, and that was a missed opportunity.
You couldn't be more right. And to actually go to that ground, you can actually see because there's some cannons in placement still where Jackson's artillery line was. It's real easy to see how the Union Army had to cross through open fire, getting raked by Jackson's men, but also to see the value breaking through that line, pushing beyond the trees. They were hell bent for water. They're like, we broken through Jackson's line, the vaunted Stonewall Jackson's line. We can roll them up right now. And you're right. I think it was three times he pretty much begged, give me a give me a fill-in force right now. I can win this side. Because Franklin had sent Meade and Gibbons, but they only had I think it was like 8,000 men altogether. Jackson has had his 38,000 man Second Corps right there. Yeah, breakthrough's great, but it's only good if it's exploited. And basically begging for men and then didn't get them, that was just it left him out to dry, which infuriated him to no end. Me, dad is. But then B, they eventually got forced back, and the line closed up, and Jackson was able to re-solidify his line and close it off. So that opportunity was lost, but it was there. And basically, an officer begging for more men that he had a breakthrough, and that didn't happen. Communication, egos. There's a lot of things that worked against him right there, and that really was good for Jackson, of course, because he was able to rally up his men, but that was a rare occurrence overall and a huge miss for the Union Army. That could have been a major victory for him right there because there wouldn't have been much to have stopped them from rolling up and pushing into Lee, and that would have started to create a pincer that he was trying to get, that Burnside was trying to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. So while all of this is going on, Burnside, the commanding general of this battle, he receives word. He's like, "Hey, we broke through the line over on Prospect Hill. We broke through Jackson's line. Let's go ahead and continue with the attack, and let's go ahead and attack Lee's west flank at Marie's Heights." So he orders that, and then how we obviously know that the Confederates are hunkered down there. They've got a great defensive position overlooking everything below. So he orders that attack. How does that play out?
Yeah, that was in a lot of ways that was tragedy to no end all by itself. For one thing, it's ever since the invention of guns, it's almost always a waste of human lives to just wave attack against an entrenched enemy in a strong position that commands the high ground. And unfortunately, Burnside just thought, well, a big push through them right through here on this flank will drive Longstreet and his men, and we'll win the day. The problem was right in front of that stone wall and those tall heights. It was a flat, open ground. So what was interesting is Longstreet was standing up there with Colonel Alexander as head of artillery, all their artillery positioned for miles down, covering the entire front. They literally watched, and they just described it too how it looked like Union men were coming from every direction, coalescing into this massive force in front of them. Then basically they just were coming hundreds of yards straight at them, and and at that point, Colonel Alexander had already told General Longstreet, "A chicken's not going to be able to live when my guns open fire on that empty field." And when they let those guns go, they basically raked. They just raked over and over, poured artillery fire into those men coming across that field. And then when the guns weren't hitting from up above, then his infantrymen down on that stone wall were just laying almost continuous fire because he had it arranged where they were basically switching out. There was almost continuous fire, and it created so much smoke they couldn't see. But that was so devastating that basically no Union man got more than got no closer than 50 yards to that stone wall during that entire assault, and it was wave after wave kept coming, and it was just like a turkey shoot for the Confederates, just mowing down ranks and ranks of those guys. Um, it was unbelievable. And a quote from Longstreet himself that I think was interesting. He had said, "With our artillery from the front, right, and left tearing through their ranks, the Federals pressed forward with almost invincible determination, maintaining their steady step and closing up their broken ranks." And right at the base was 2,500 Georgians and North Carolinians that were just continuous fire as well into those, and it was just in a member of the firing line also said the ground resembled an immense hog pen, and them all killed the Union men. So a lot of times that's what comes to mind when we talk about Fredericksburg is that immense loss of life in a fruitless frontal charge, but it cost Burnside and the Union Army over 8,000 men in just that assault, on those repeated assaults alone. That was just horrific losses between the maimed, the wounded, and there's some buildings still left around there with bullet holes in them that Confederates would use in there also to shoot, and the remnants of the sunken road and the stone wall, or just give you an idea as to the protection, the excellent position the Confederates occupied, and even the little bit of exposed ground that still exists now, you can really, when you stand there, you can visualize taking the buildings that have grown up out of it and really see there was no way they were getting up to that position with the artillery commanding the heights and that entrenched infantry down below. It was just a lose lose.
Yeah, that was truly devastating, a massive tactical error. I can't imagine what was going through Burnside's head there. I guess he figured he had so many men that he could just throw all these men at the problem and eventually he'd take the heights, but vastly outnumbered, the Confederates were able to hold him off. I mean,
And what's interesting is even after all of that, and that brought the day to an end, he actually wanted to kind of continue this assault and the battle the next day. He wanted to basically do the same thing, and his officers were like, "You can't be serious. We can't do this. This is horrific." And luckily cooler heads prevailed, but yeah, that was just a very unfortunate tactical decision that achieved zero, unfortunately, other than costing a lot of lives.
I would like to bring up that night because that battle took place throughout the day. And as you know, dust set, night came in, and it's a cold December night. The Union soldiers are still out there on the battlefield. They weren't able to withdraw, or they haven't yet. So these Union soldiers, they're lying amongst their dead and wounded. You can hear the moans from the wounded, and everyone's just kind of sitting there. I can't imagine what that would be like as a soldier. You're sitting out there amongst your brothers on the battlefield, killed and wounded. It's freezing cold in December in Virginia. I mean, just truly awful, awful, and demoralizing.
Yep, and a lot of times weather is the biggest enemy of a military force, and it still holds true now. Even with all this technology that we have, the weather is the ultimate equalizer. So Napoleon faced that when he invaded Russia in 1812. The Russian winter devastated his army more than any battle did over there. And here too, it dropped 24 degrees and colder. There was frostbite on men. Some men died of that. They were just literally, some could freeze to death, some did. I mean, but also the fact that how they charged over and over against an entrenched enemy there and got and we're just felt like, what are we doing? We're just charging to our death. Um, so many reports from soldiers and men that were part of those assaults and how fruitless it was, and they expected to die, especially when they saw the Confederate artillery ringed in front of them, and then the infantry fire pouring into them. There were so many reports. I don't expect to live the day out from different Union troops. But also that night, to your point, those that did survive then faced a different enemy, the enemy of the cold. So they've already been demoralized from the battle where it went. They've also then got to face a cold night where healthcare wasn't that great in the old days. If you got any kind of injury, your chances were dicey if you were going to come out of it. So that's a whole nother thing. So that really claimed it's a lot of souls as well. But there's a lot when morale's high, you can overcome a lot. So on the other side, the Confederacy was riding pretty good. They had the heights. Jackson was able to beat back, and his Second Corps was able to close up his line and push back on Prospect Hill. Um, then Longstreet was able to commandingly own the frontal assault there at Marie's Heights, so had no issues there. So even though it wasn't a planned battle, Lee by this point was feeling really good that his 78,000 Army of Northern Virginia was really given a shellacking to the behemoth Union Army of about 123,000 because he utilized all the territory to maximum advantage and the conditions of the environment too, to offset the numerical advantage the Union Army had.
Yeah, yeah, I believe Lee was said to have said, "It was magnificent, but it was not war." He obviously was happy about a Confederate victory, but the way Burnside was just throwing division after division of Union soldiers at the hill and just them getting, raked down, killed after killed, it was terrible to watch, whether you were winning the battle or not. It was awful to watch. Um, so we get through that night, sporadic fire kind of continues, and eventually Burnside comes to his senses, says, this battle is lost. I am not going to get anywhere near these heights. So he orders the withdrawal. And how does he cope with the defeat?
That was for Burnside. That really is a big psychological blow, but also even more so, it was a massive psychological blow to the Union as a whole. President Lincoln was devastated hearing the amount of loss, and that it President Lincoln, for one, to his credit, was always trying to find that right general in chief, and he wasn't afraid to shuffle the cards up accordingly, which is what led to Burnside having the job anyways, because McClellan didn't prosecute the battle against after Antietam to go after Lee, so he basically fired him in a snowstorm. President Lincoln sent an officer. He basically, here's your letter. You're fired. Hey Burnside, you're promoted. Congratulations. So, but the same thing would happen to Burnside. Eventually Burnside would be replaced as well. So, but that was really a big black mark on the Union because they really needed strong victories, so they could justify kind of the struggle. They're trying to keep the Union together, but also, anytime Lee's in the field, he became so early. His skill with maneuvering his army around and outgunning, let's say, and out fighting Union generals was just really starting to build more by this point of the war. This just solidified that, but it also bought breathing room for the Confederacy and the political establishment in Richmond, because the Union Army, if they would have won at Fredericksburg, they would have pushed on to Richmond, Virginia. So Lee, fighting his offense defensive style, was able to basically protect Richmond again and push them back and drive them back over the river to buy them breathing room there, as you will say, because McClellan tried the Peninsula Campaign as well, trying to push into Richmond as well, but Lee was able to do what he always did so well and use what he had to turn a lot more out of it to his advantage. And he sure did at Fredericksburg. And that was a psychological blow both to the Union Army at the time, but to the Union officials in D.C. as well.
Yeah, Lee was quite the tactician, huh? But back to Burnside, after he withdraws, I mean, he just got, as you said, he just got promoted. He's this brand new, sparkly new general, and immediately just has a crushing, brutal defeat. I mean, the Union's probably worst defeat of the entire war. I mean, I can't imagine, psychologically what that does to him, but he goes to Lincoln afterwards and hands in his resignation, correct?
Yep. Yeah, that was in a lot of ways, that devastating loss was exactly what Burnside, in many ways, was afraid of. When he took when he was kind of voluntarily voluntold that he's the new commander in chief, that he knew where his strengths were, and he just felt he was out of his league commanding the entire army like that. So for him, it was crushing psychologically, and his conscience told him, I can't. It cost this many thousands of men their lives. We didn't gain anything out of this at all. We're basically back where we started, and now we're even worse because we lost all these young men. So yeah, it was too much for Burnside. So he had to mea culpa, basically, kind of die on the sword, as the Japanese say, and kind of turned it back over and said it's somebody else's turn. I, I, I failed this, basically.
Yeah, that's terrible, especially after witnessing, all your soldiers dying and you're the one who gave the orders for the battle. I I mean, he probably didn't forget that until he went to his grave, that would keep me up every night.
Absolutely. And you alluded to a great point with Lee. Lee, during this battle, when they clearly won, he was not jubilant by any means as to the loss of life. And it was really a sad affair for him too, because the whole thing for him was like, we're seeing young boys that are still their brethren. They're just in blue, and his are on, you know, Confederate graves, we'll say, that they're just being sent to their deaths, and his men were doing the killing as the other ones were just marching right into the gunfire. So yeah, it was a really poignant and sad affair that could be representative of the entire Civil War itself. Really, is that it was horrific and sad, and the loss of life was unimaginable. And that's kind of a microcosm at Fredericksburg, if you think about it. Unfortunately, there's 3 more years, almost 3 more years beyond this yet, where it just continues. But the percentages of casualties were really horrific out of Fredericksburg.
Yeah, and Fredericksburg really stayed in the minds of the Union soldiers up until the end of the war. I believe at Gettysburg, it was kind of the roles were reversed. The Confederates were rushing up the hill, Union pouring down on them, and they were actually shouting Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, because they didn't want the Confederates to forget what they did to them at Fredericksburg, which is kind of this sad full circle. It's really, really terrible, but that's how it played out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Fredericksburg also tested water crossing, which was a lesson that's been put into play a lot. The urban combat, but what was also present there that isn't discussed much is the Union had use of balloons for observation there too. The Union had the Balloon Corps that was started by Thaddeus Lowe, and their big patron actually was McClellan. So they did have two balloons at Fredericksburg that were used for observation for the arrival of part of the Confederate Army that were observed. And it wasn't much longer after this they were disbanded because the successors to McClellan were not big fans of the Balloon Corps. They thought their investment for manpower and troops that had to be allotted to help move the carts of the gas machines that powered them wasn't worth all the time. But there were a couple there though that did provide some aerial reconnaissance to help the Union identify which men were arriving for the Confederate Army. So that's a little tidbit that's often overlooked too, but it did play a small part in being present and visible to both sides there actually.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting tactic, and it evolves into the spy planes and drones we see today. So that's another first from this battle. Balloons, which yeah, I'm sure not many people know about. I didn't. Um yeah, quite fascinating. There's a lot that evolved from this battle, right? We see the first beachhead, and we see that again, obviously D-Day, stuff like that. Urban combat, especially, we saw that a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then, yeah, like the aerial reconnaissance. There's just so much that stemmed from this battle. that I feel like it's almost one of the most, aside from Gettysburg, the most important battle of the Civil War, just because there's so much that evolved from it, and it was so impactful.
It really is, and, for anybody that ever visits Fredericksburg, as a town, it's fantastic. It's a fantastic small town. It has a small town feel, there's so much history, but it has all the modern amenities outside. Me, I love the fact that it's so historical because they've done such an excellent job of trying to preserve and continue to preserve more of that American story that is part of our collective American story there. And it just there's so much to be gained that you get to walk on that ground and see at Prospect Hill those those few men that would have came through this semi-open ground getting raked by Confederate guns and pushing up over the berm and finally breaking through, or Maurice Heights to actually stand in the sunken road. You can kind of visualize, wow, that would have been horrific. I mean, to come right in this open flat ground and just get mowed down, it's like mind-boggling to think about that. Or to go to the Rappahannock where they have some reproduced pontoon bridges that were actually made for a film on the Battle of Fredericksburg that are still out, and they sit where you can see that were made similar to what they were at the time, which is just amazing to get an idea how that worked, and how you can almost visualize how after the engineers stopped trying to paddle those across, that it was Michigan infantrymen that were literally in these, some of them using their butts of their guns trying to paddle to get across, and they're going zigzagging all over the place trying to get across as they're getting shot from Confederates. But they're so mad now, they just want to get across and take it to the enemy. That it gives you a whole different perspective, and it makes it so much more visceral and real to kind of be right there and envision what some of our forefathers went through in that context.
Yeah, I've never been, but I would absolutely love to visit one day. It's so surreal to be in a historical place like that and just, you're right, visualize, so many years ago, our forefathers were right here doing whatever they're doing. In this case, the Battle of Fredericksburg. They were right here fighting each other. This is Maurice Heights. This is where the Union soldiers were getting mowed down. This is where they crossed the river. It's just fascinating to visualize that, only what, 180 years ago, 170 years ago, they were they were right there in the heat of battle, and it's in the, you know, blink of time. It's not that long ago. That's three generations ago, and it's always fascinating to me to kind of be in a historical place and visualize that not so long ago, this is what was happening here.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I would always recommend that for anyone that if try to find your connection to Civil War history, especially, but I would say any history, but Civil War history, it's so poignant still because there are a lot of connections and threads that a lot of Americans have to somebody at some point that fought in the war, and that's our collective story. It was a tragic event, but it's an important event because it did help to shape who we are, and we have a lot to learn still from that to hopefully make us better now. I think understanding history, I think, is so critical so we can understand the context of when it occurred, why it occurred, but also its effects that it does have to this day. They resonate forever. All historical events resonate to the modern day in some way. There's nothing that stands alone. And it's so important that if you can find that connection, find your link. If you're buying a battlefield site, you know, just you owe it to yourself to actually spend some time, just walk those areas, read some of the placards, maybe research a little bit on your own. It's just the amazing depth and the humanity and all those is it's just priceless. And books will fill it out, but to really be boots on the ground, you can't replace it. Then it's a sensory experience as well, and it's really powerful.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. We owe it to ourselves and we owe it to our ancestors. You know what I mean? They're the ones who actually lived through these events. We owe it to them so that their story is not forgotten, right? We learn history so the past isn't repeated, but we owe it to them so their story doesn't get forgotten.
Hallelujah. I agree. I agree.
Well, Michael, it has been an absolute pleasure. I sure learned a lot. I hope the audience did too. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Always happy to talk history.